You ever have a moment in your life that you wish you could erase? Not just forget, but completely remove like it never happened? Because I do. And no matter how much I try to push it away, it lingers. It clings to me like a shadow. A stain on my soul that I can't scrub clean. They say betrayal comes from the ones closest to you, but what if I told you that the person who shattered my world wasn't my husband, wasn't my best friend, but someone I never, ever saw coming? It's been 2 years since that day, 2 years since everything I thought I knew about love, loyalty, and trust got ripped apart. And if you told me back then that this would be my reality, that my life would spiral the way it did, I would have laughed in your face. But life has a way of throwing you into storms you never signed up for. And this storm? It wrecked everything in its path. See, this isn't just a story about infidelity. It's about loneliness, desperation, and the ugly truths we don't like to admit, not even to ourselves. What happened next left me questioning everything, who I was, what I stood for, and whether I'd crossed a line I could never come back from. And the worst part? I didn't see it coming until it was too late. What happened next left me questioning everything. Before I take you into this story, just know, this is real. This is raw. And it's something I never thought I'd say out loud. Subscribe now if you're ready to hear the kind of stories that no one else is willing to tell, the stories that reveal the truth about human relationships, the good, the bad, and the downright unthinkable. If you were to drive down my street, you'd think it was just another quiet, picture-perfect neighborhood. The kind where kids ride their bikes, couples walk their dogs, and neighbors wave at each other from their driveways. Safe. Normal. But let me tell you something, nothing is ever as perfect as it seems. I lived in one of those houses. A cozy, well-kept home with a trimmed lawn, a front porch swing, and a husband who was always busy. We had been married for years. Not the kind of marriage that was fiery and passionate, but the kind that just existed. We functioned. We coexisted. Like two strangers who shared the same space, the same bed, but not much else. He worked long hours. Traveled for business. By the time he got home, he was too tired to talk. Too exhausted to ask how my day was, too distracted to notice when I changed my hair, too indifferent to realize how lonely I was becoming. I stopped bringing it up. Stopped trying. Because what was the point? And that's when I met her, my neighbor, Lisa. Lisa had that effortless kind of charm. The type of woman who could strike up a conversation with anyone and make them feel like they had known her forever. She was friendly, chatty, always inviting me over for coffee or just to kill time. And honestly, I needed that. She'd sit across from me, sipping her iced tea, venting about her own life, her stress, her family drama, her struggles. And in return, I'd share bits and pieces of mine. Not the deep, ugly truths. Just enough to let her know that my life wasn't as perfect as it seemed either. And that's when I first met him, her stepson, Ryan. I remember the first time I saw him. He had just come back from the gym, a towel slung over his shoulder, beads of sweat glistening on his skin. He wasn't a kid, he was a man. Tall, confident. And there was something about the way he carried himself, the way his eyes held a quiet intensity, that made him stand out. Lisa introduced us casually. "Oh, this is Ryan. My husband's son from his first marriage. He's staying with us for a while before heading back to school." I smiled. He smiled back. Polite. Harmless. Just a normal exchange. At least, that's what I thought at the time. At first, I barely noticed him. He was just there, coming and going, sitting in the backyard with his headphones in, passing by while I chatted with Lisa. And when we did talk, it was nothing more than surface-level small talk. How's the weather? What shows are good lately? The kind of polite, meaningless conversations you have with someone who isn't supposed to matter in your life. But looking back now, I realize he was watching me. Not in an obvious, creepy way. No, it was subtle. A glance held a little too long. A small smirk when our eyes met. Like he knew something I didn't. And maybe a part of me knew it too. Because for the first time in a long time, someone was looking at me like I was seen. It happened on a random afternoon. Nothing special about that day. Just another quiet, uneventful afternoon, the kind that blends into the rest. Lisa had asked me to come over for coffee, as she usually did. We sat at the kitchen table, laughing about something trivial, when Ryan walked in. He leaned against the counter, poured himself a drink, and casually joined the conversation. I don't even remember what we were talking about, but at some point, Lisa had to step outside to take a phone call. And suddenly, it was just me and him. That's when it happened, the first moment where the air between us shifted. Ryan looked at me, really looked at me, and said, I don't get it. I frowned. Get what? He tilted his head, studying me for a second before saying, why you always look so sad when no one's watching. It was such a simple observation, but it hit me like a punch to the stomach. Because it was true. I laughed it off, told him he was imagining things. But he just smirked, shook his head, and said, no, I see it. Lisa walked back in before I could respond. But that moment? It stuck with me. Like an itch I couldn't scratch. Because for the first time in years, someone noticed. And that was dangerous. I told myself it was nothing. A harmless comment. But why did it make my chest tighten? Why did it stay in my head long after I left? Days passed, and I kept catching him watching me. Not in an intrusive way. Just observing. As if he was trying to figure me out. And the worst part? A small, pathetic part of me liked it. God, how embarrassing is that? A grown woman, flustered over the attention of someone so much younger. But it wasn't about him. It was about what he represented, something I had been missing. And once you realize what you've been deprived of for so long, it's almost impossible to ignore. I started to notice the way he spoke to me. The way his compliments were always just a little too thoughtful. The way his presence lingered whenever Lisa wasn't around. He wasn't obvious. He was careful. Almost calculated. And maybe that's what made it worse. Because it meant it wasn't just in my head. The worst part? I never stopped it. I should have. I should have shut it down the moment I felt that first spark of heat in my chest. But I didn't. And that was my first mistake. You think you know yourself. You think you know what lines you would never cross. Until one day, you find yourself standing right at the edge of it. And sometimes, you don't even realize you've already taken the first step. Things only got worse from here. If you've ever been in a situation like this, or know someone who has, tell me in the comments. What would you have done? Because at this point, I was already in too deep. Subscribe now, because what happens next? I promise you won't see it coming. It was just another ordinary afternoon. Or at least, that's what I told myself. Lisa had invited me over for coffee, like she always did. It was part of our routine, sit at her kitchen table, sip on something warm, and talk about nothing and everything. And on that particular day, I needed the distraction. Needed to escape my own house, where the silence had become deafening. My husband was away for work again. And even when he was home, it barely made a difference. So I went. I walked across the lawn, through her front door, and into what should have been just another harmless afternoon. Lisa poured us both coffee, sighing as she settled into her chair. You ever just wake up exhausted for no reason? She groaned, rubbing her temples. I chuckled. That's called being an adult, Lisa. She rolled her eyes. Well, I hate it. I smiled, but my mind was elsewhere. Drifting. Lost in thoughts I didn't want to have. And then, just as I was about to say something, he walked in. Ryan, Lisa's stepson. He was fresh out of the shower, a towel slung over his shoulder, damp hair curling slightly at the ends. He had this effortless confidence about him, like he knew exactly how people saw him and played into it just enough without seeming like he was trying too hard. Hey, he said casually, pouring himself a glass of water. Lisa barely looked up. Hey, kiddo. You remember my friend, right? He smirked, glancing at me. Of course I do. Something about the way he said it made my stomach tighten. But I ignored it. Just a polite greeting, nothing more. He leaned against the counter, sipping his water, watching me in a way that felt different. It wasn't just a passing glance. It was something else. Something I couldn't quite name. You look different today, he said suddenly. I blinked. Different? Yeah, he said, tilting his head slightly. Good different. Like, I don't know. You did something new? Haircut? I felt Lisa's eyes flicker toward me for a brief second before she went back to scrolling on her phone. I forced a laugh. No, nothing new. Huh, he mused, taking another sip. Well, whatever it is, it works. It was a simple compliment. Harmless. At least, it should have been. But the way he said it, the way his gaze lingered just a second too long, it made my skin warm in a way I hadn't felt in years. I dismissed it, laughed it off, told myself I was overthinking it. But even after he left the room, that strange energy stayed, hung in the air between Lisa and me like an unspoken question neither of us was willing to acknowledge. And the worst part? I didn't hate it. That night, as I lay in bed next to my husband, staring at the ceiling, I replayed that moment over and over again in my head. The way Ryan had looked at me, the way his words had sent a spark through me that I wasn't prepared for. It had been so long since someone noticed me, truly noticed me. And even though I knew it was wrong, even though I knew I should have pushed it aside, I couldn't deny that for the first time in a long time. I felt something. But that's all it was, right? A fleeting moment. A meaningless exchange. Nothing more. At least, that's what I kept telling myself. But deep down, I think I already knew the truth. This wasn't the end of something. It was the beginning. The next time I saw Ryan, things felt different. Not in an obvious way. Just small things. The way his eyes lingered a little longer when he spoke to me. The way his voice dropped just slightly when he said my name. And I should have stopped it. Should have shut it down before it even had the chance to become something dangerous. But I didn't. Instead, I let it happen. Let the conversations grow longer. Let the silences between words stretch just a little too far. Let myself become curious about him in a way I had no business being. And the worst part? He knew exactly what he was doing. Because one afternoon, when Lisa wasn't home and I was standing at her kitchen sink, rinsing out my coffee mug, I felt him step closer. Too close. You always this tense? He murmured, his voice laced with something I couldn't quite name. I swallowed hard, forcing a laugh. You're imagining things. No, I'm not, he said smoothly. You ever just let go? My breath caught in my throat. I turned to face him, intending to shut it down, to tell him to stop, but the way he looked at me, it was like he already knew he had me. And in that moment, I realized something that made my stomach twist with both excitement and guilt. I didn't want him to stop. Have you ever found yourself in a situation where you knew you should walk away, but something kept pulling you back in? What would you have done? Tell me in the comments below. Subscribe now, because what happens next? It changes everything. I told myself it was nothing. Just a compliment. A passing remark. A brief moment of attention that I shouldn't have thought twice about. But I did. I thought about it that night. And the next morning. And again when I saw my reflection in the mirror, touching my hair, wondering if I really did look different. Wondering what exactly he saw that made him say it. And then, like clockwork, reality hit. Because as I stood there, picking apart the memory, my husband walked right past me without so much as a glance. No good morning. No acknowledgement. Just a man moving through his life on autopilot, too wrapped up in work, emails, and meetings to notice me anymore. I wasn't angry. Not really. I had stopped expecting anything different a long time ago. But that didn't mean it didn't hurt. And that's when it started, the slow unraveling. I remember the first time he texted me. It was late. My husband was asleep beside me, his body turned away, his breathing deep and steady, lost in dreams that didn't include me. I wasn't expecting a message at that hour. My phone buzzed softly, and when I picked it up, my breath caught in my throat. Ryan, you look nice today. That's all it said. For simple words. Nothing inappropriate. Nothing overtly suggestive. But my hands trembled as I read it. I stared at the screen, my heart pounding in my chest. I should ignore it, I thought. I should turn off my phone, roll over, and pretend I never saw it. Instead, I typed back. Me, thanks. That's sweet of you. I hit send. My finger hovered over the screen, debating whether to delete the conversation. But before I could decide, another message came through. Ryan, sweet? Nah, just honest. I bit my lip, a strange warmth creeping up my spine. There was something about the way he spoke, not just in words, but in the space between them. The way they lingered. The way they made me feel something I hadn't felt in so long. Alive. And that? That was dangerous. At first, they were casual. Harmless. Or at least, that's what I kept telling myself. Morning texts. Random jokes. Little check-ins that made my stomach flutter in a way I refused to acknowledge. And every time my phone buzzed, my pulse quickened. Not just from excitement, but from guilt. Because I knew what this was. I knew the road I was stepping onto. But I didn't stop. Because how do you walk away from something that makes you feel wanted, when you've spent years feeling invisible? He was so easy. Talking to him felt natural, effortless. He noticed things no one else did. The way I twirled my ring when I was nervous. The way my voice changed when I was holding back something I wanted to say. The way my laughter sounded different when it was forced. He made me feel seen. And that was an intoxicating feeling. It had been a long day. My husband was home, but only physically. He sat at his desk, hunched over his laptop, responding to emails, barely glancing at me when I walked past. I sighed, picking up my phone, scrolling absent-mindedly when I saw the notification. Ryan, if you were mine. I'd never take you for granted. My breath hitched. My fingers tightened around the phone. My heart pounded so loudly I could barely hear anything else. This was different. This wasn't a joke, or a compliment, or a passing remark. This was a line. A line I should never have let him cross. I knew I should shut it down. Knew I should tell him to stop. Knew I should delete the conversation and pretend it never happened. But I didn't. Instead, I stared at the words. Reread them. Let them sink in. Because as wrong as it was, a tiny, broken part of me wanted to hear it. So instead of blocking his number, instead of saying, "This needs to stop," I did something worse. I let it continue. From that moment on, everything changed. It was subtle at first. The way I started dressing differently. The way I lingered in front of the mirror just a little longer. The way I checked my phone constantly, waiting for his messages. I told myself I wasn't doing anything wrong. That words weren't actions. That as long as nothing physical happened, I wasn't really betraying my husband. But deep down, I knew better. Because the betrayal had already started, in my heart. And once you open that door, even just a crack, it's nearly impossible to close. It was bound to happen. The moment where the tension became unbearable. Where the pull between us became something I could no longer ignore. It happened late one evening at Lisa's house. She had stepped out for a quick errand, leaving me and Ryan alone. It wasn't planned, but the second the door closed behind her, the air shifted. He was sitting on the couch, his phone in his hand, but his eyes were on me. Always on me. "You're quiet tonight," he murmured, his voice low, smooth. I forced a small laugh. "Just tired." He studied me for a long moment before speaking. "No, it's something else." I swallowed hard, looking away. "Ryan," he leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "You want me to stop? Say the word. I'll stop. But don't lie to me." I felt my breath catch in my throat. Because I knew what he was really asking. "Do you want this? Do you want me?" And God help me. I didn't know how to answer. Once the line is crossed, there's no turning back. Have you ever been caught between what's right and what feels impossible to resist? What would you have done? Tell me in the comments. There's a moment, a split second, when you realize you've crossed a line. When you know, deep in your gut, that there's no going back. And yet, instead of turning around, instead of running the other way, you take another step forward. And then another. And before you know it, you're standing in the middle of something you never intended, something you can't undo. That was me. And by the time I realized how deep I was in, it was already too late. It started small, subtle, barely noticeable if you weren't paying attention. But I was. Ryan found excuses to be near me. Little things. Walking into the kitchen when he knew I was making coffee. forgetting something in the living room when I was alone in there, pausing just a little too long when we spoke, as if waiting for me to say something first. And I noticed myself changing too, taking a little longer to get ready in the mornings, picking outfits that I knew looked better on me, checking my phone too often, feeling a tiny thrill whenever his name lit up my screen. I told myself it was innocent, that nothing would happen, that I was just enjoying the attention. But deep down, I knew I was playing with fire. One night, I found myself sitting in bed, scrolling through my phone, my husband asleep beside me. He hadn't kissed me goodnight, hadn't asked how my day was, just slipped under the covers, turned off the light, and drifted off, like I wasn't even there. And then, my phone buzzed. "Ryan, can't sleep?" I hesitated. I should have ignored it. I should have put my phone away and closed my eyes. But my fingers moved before my brain could stop them. Me, no. You, Ryan, no. Thinking too much. My heart thudded against my ribcage. This was dangerous. But there was something about the quiet of the night, about the way the darkness made everything feel more intimate, more secretive. And so, I did something I had never done before. I let the conversation continue. We talked. For hours. About life. About regrets. About how strange it was that two people could feel lonely even when surrounded by others. He told me things I never expected him to say, things about his past, about how he always felt like he was living in someone else's shadow. And I told him things I never told anyone. It was the kind of conversation that didn't feel like words. It felt like gravity. By the time I finally put my phone down, the sun was creeping over the horizon. And in that moment, as I stared at the ceiling, one terrifying thought crossed my mind. This wasn't just about attention anymore. This was something else. Something bigger. Something I wasn't sure I had the strength to stop. The next time I saw him, I could feel the difference. The energy between us was heavier now, charged with something unspoken. Lisa had asked me to help her in the backyard, moving some furniture. It was warm outside, the sun casting a golden glow over everything. She stepped inside for a moment, leaving me and Ryan alone. I was pulling a chair across the patio when I felt him behind me. Close. Too close. I turned, intending to say something, but then, it happened. His hand brushed mine. A light touch. Barely there. But it sent a jolt through my body, like an electric current. I froze. So did he. And in that moment, in the thick, suffocating silence between us, I knew we had just crossed an invisible line. He didn't move. Neither did I. Our eyes met, and for a split second, the world stopped. Lisa's voice called from inside, breaking the moment. I pulled my hand back as if I had been burned, my heart slamming against my ribs. It was nothing. A simple accident. That's what I told myself. But we both knew better. That night, I stood in front of the bathroom mirror, gripping the sink, staring at my own reflection like I was looking at a stranger. What was I doing? What was I letting happen? I thought about my husband, about how distant he had become, about how I had spent years waiting for him to notice me, to see me, to want me. And then, I thought about Ryan, about the way he looked at me, about the way my body reacted to him without permission. I was spiraling. Fast. And I knew it. So I made a decision. I was going to stop this. Right now. Before it became something irreversible. I was going to pull away. Set boundaries. Go back to my life and pretend none of this had ever happened. Because that was the right thing to do. But then, the next morning, another text came through. Ryan, meet me. And God help me. I didn't say no. I should have never gone that night. I knew it the second I stepped inside Lisa's house. The air was too thick, the lights too warm, the noise too loud. And yet, the only sound I could hear was the rapid thudding of my own heartbeat. Because tonight, everyone was here. My husband. Lisa. Ryan. I told myself it was fine. That I could handle it. That I could sit across from Ryan at the dinner table and pretend nothing had changed. Pretend the heat between us wasn't suffocating. Pretend I wasn't remembering the way his hand had lingered on mine, the way his text messages had made my breath hitch in the middle of the night. But pretending had never been my strong suit. Lisa had put together one of her usual gatherings, a mix of neighbors, friends, and a few coworkers. My husband stood in the corner, drink in hand, laughing at something one of the other men had said. And I was standing in the middle of the room, a wine glass I wasn't really drinking from pressed between my fingers, my body locked in a tension so thick it felt like I was drowning in it. Ryan was across the room, talking to someone, but every so often, every few minutes, our eyes met. Quick glances. A second too long. A flicker of something unspoken. And God help me, I was hanging on to those stolen moments like they were the only thing keeping me breathing. You okay? Lisa's voice snapped me out of it, her eyes narrowing slightly. I forced a smile, nodding. Yeah, just tired. Lie. I wasn't tired. I was unraveling. Somewhere between conversations and forced laughter, I found myself in the kitchen, refilling my wine glass, trying to steady my hands, trying to drown out the thoughts racing through my mind. And then I felt it. That presence. That shift in the air. I didn't have to turn around to know it was him. Ryan stepped in, his footsteps slow, deliberate. The party noise faded behind us, leaving only the sound of the refrigerator humming, the distant echo of someone's laughter from the other room. And then he was right there. Too close. Close enough that I could feel the heat radiating from his body. Close enough that my breath hitched in my throat. You look beautiful tonight, he murmured, his voice low, intimate. Like a confession. Like a challenge. My fingers tightened around the glass. Ryan, he leaned in, his breath warm against my ear. Tell me you don't think about it. I froze. My pulse hammered against my ribs. My stomach twisted into knots. Because it was one thing to dance around it, to play with fire from a distance. But this was real. This was the moment where the choice had to be made. Tell him to stop. Walk away. Save yourself. But before I could say anything, before I could even process what was happening, the sound was sharp, cutting through the air like a knife. Someone was coming. Ryan pulled back, just enough. Just enough for me to see the flicker of something dark in his eyes. Possessive. Daring. And for a brief second, the world stopped. Was it my husband? Did he see us? Did he hear what Ryan said? My stomach twisted with fear. With guilt. With something I didn't even want to name. My husband walked into the kitchen, his gaze sweeping over me, then Ryan. His eyes narrowed slightly, just a flicker of something. Suspicion? Or was I just imagining it? Everything okay in here? He asked, his voice casual. Too casual. I forced a smile. Yeah, just grabbing some wine. Ryan didn't say anything. He just watched me. And I could feel it. The weight of his gaze. The silent conversation we were having in that moment. My husband nodded, distracted, already turning to grab a beer from the fridge. He didn't see the way Ryan's fingers brushed against mine as he reached for a napkin. He didn't see the way I tensed, the way my breath stuttered. Or maybe he did. Maybe he felt it. That crack in the foundation. That shift in the air. Because that night as we drove home, as he pulled into the driveway, he didn't speak. Didn't look at me the same way. And in the silence between us, one terrifying thought echoed through my mind. He knows. Once the truth begins to unravel, there's no stopping it. What would you have done in my place? Do you think my husband knew? Or was it all in my head? Tell me in the comments below. Subscribe now, because what happens next? It's the moment where everything comes crashing down. The morning after the party, everything felt wrong. The world outside was the same, the sun still rose, people still went about their routines, but inside me, inside this house, nothing felt normal anymore. Because no matter how hard I tried to convince myself otherwise, I had crossed a line. I barely slept. My mind replayed the night over and over, the way Ryan's voice had curled around my name in that dark kitchen, the way his breath had brushed against my skin like a whispered promise. And worse, the way my husband had looked at me in the car, like he knew, or at least, like he felt something was off. Guilt sat heavy on my chest, thick and suffocating. I had told myself I wasn't doing anything wrong, that I was just playing with the idea of something dangerous, but never actually stepping into it. But last night had shattered that lie. Because if I had to lie to myself about what it was, then it was already too much. I walked into the kitchen, my hands cold despite the warm coffee mug I held. My husband was at the table, scrolling through his phone, dressed in his usual button-down, preparing to leave for work. Same routine. Same silence. Except today, the silence felt different. "Morning," he said, barely looking up. "Morning," I murmured back, my voice thinner than I meant it to be. I waited for something. A question. A hint of suspicion. A comment about how distant I seemed last night. But it never came. Instead, he reached for his coffee, sipped it, and kept scrolling through his emails like nothing had changed. And that should have been a relief. It should have made me exhale, loosen my shoulders, let go of the fear clenching my stomach. But it didn't. Because the fact that he didn't notice, that he didn't feel my absence even when I was sitting right next to him, that hurt in a way I wasn't ready to admit. And then, just as I turned to grab a plate, Ryan walked in. I stiffened. My fingers curled tightly around the counter's edge, my breath locking in my throat. Because this was it. The first moment after last night. The moment where everything would be different. Except it wasn't. Ryan moved like nothing had happened. Like he hadn't stood inches from me, whispered words that shouldn't have been said. Like we weren't tangled in something dangerous, something messy, something that had already begun to consume me from the inside out. He glanced at me once, a lazy half-smile tugging at his lips. Morning. And that was it. Morning. Like we were nothing more than two people in the same house, caught in the same casual routine. Like I wasn't unraveling inside. I forced myself to respond. Morning. But it felt hollow. Forced. A lie wrapped in politeness. My husband didn't even look up. He had no idea that right there, standing in the same kitchen as him, a silent war was raging inside me. I told myself I would stop. That last night was a wake-up call. That I couldn't let this continue, not when it was already consuming my thoughts, stealing my focus, making me feel things I wasn't supposed to feel. But stopping wasn't as easy as I thought. Because Ryan? He wasn't backing off. If anything, he was pushing harder. It was in the way he brushed past me in the hallway when no one was looking, just enough for our arms to graze. It was in the way his eyes lingered when Lisa and my husband were talking, the ghost of a smirk playing at his lips. It was in the late-night texts. The ones that made my heart pound, even as I told myself not to answer. It was past midnight. My husband was beside me, his back turned, his body relaxed in sleep. I had spent the whole night forcing myself to stay away from my phone, promising myself that I wouldn't do this again, that I wouldn't let it go any further. But then my screen lit up. Ryan, still awake. I stared at it. My pulse quickened. My fingers hovered over the screen. I should ignore it. I should put my phone down and go to sleep. But I didn't. Instead, I hesitated just a second too long. And that's when I felt it, my husband moved. Rolled over. His eyes fluttered open slightly, groggy, unfocused. And then they landed on my phone. I panicked. Clicked the screen off too fast. Too obvious. And for the first time in years, my husband actually looked at me. Really looked at me. "Who was that?" he asked, his voice thick with sleep. I swallowed. My heart pounded. My mouth went dry. Just. Lisa, I lied. And in that moment, I felt it, the weight of the lie settling between us, thick and suffocating. He didn't question it. Didn't push. Just made a small sound of acknowledgement before turning over again, pulling the blanket higher over his shoulder. And that should have been the end of it. But as I lay there, my phone still clutched in my hand, my heart still racing, I knew the truth. I had just done something I could never take back. Cheating doesn't start with a kiss. It doesn't start in a bed or behind locked doors. It starts here. In the small, stolen moments. In the spaces between what's said and what's left unsaid. In the way your heart races when it shouldn't. In the lies you tell, not to protect the other person, but to protect yourself. And lying to my husband? That was the moment I knew. I was already too far gone. Have you ever laid in bed, staring at the ceiling, feeling like the walls are closing in on you? Like the air in the room is too thick, pressing down on your chest, making it impossible to breathe. That was me. That night, lying next to my husband, listening to his steady breathing, feeling the warmth of his body only inches away. I should have felt safe. I should have felt at peace. But I didn't. I felt trapped. Trapped in my choices. Trapped in my mistakes. I turned my head slightly, looking at him in the dim light. He was completely unaware of the storm raging inside me, of the war I was fighting within myself. He trusted me. He believed in me. And I had just lied to his face. My stomach twisted. Guilt burned in my chest, hot and suffocating. Was I really going to risk my entire marriage for this? For a few stolen moments of attention? For a thrill that I knew deep down would lead nowhere good? Because that's what this was, wasn't it? A slow, deliberate self-destruction. And I was watching myself fall, powerless to stop it. I wasn't just craving attention. It wasn't just about feeling wanted, or seen, or noticed. I wanted to feel alive again. And that realization hit me harder than anything else. Because if I needed someone else to remind me that I was still breathing, still desirable, still a woman beyond the title of wife, then what did that say about me? About my marriage? About the life I had built? Was I broken? Was my marriage broken? Or was I just running from something I didn't want to face? I wanted to believe this wasn't about Ryan. That it was about me. That I was just waking up from something, shaking off years of numbness, rediscovering a piece of myself I had long forgotten. But wasn't that just another lie? Another excuse to justify the choices I was making? Because the truth was simple. If I kept this up, I would lose everything. Guilt clawed at me, an unbearable weight pressing down on my chest. But beneath it, deep, buried under layers of rationalization and self-loathing, was something else. Desire. And that terrified me. Because guilt was expected. Guilt made sense. But desire? Wanting something I knew would destroy me. That was dangerous. Because desire doesn't listen to reason. It doesn't care about consequences. It doesn't care about the life you've built, the people you'll hurt, the vows you've made. It only knows hunger. It only knows longing. And that's why I knew this wasn't over. Not yet. When I woke up, my husband was already out of bed. The other side of the mattress was cold, his absence stretching between us like an unspoken truth. I moved through the morning in a daze, pouring coffee, staring at the countertop, barely hearing my husband's voice as he talked about his schedule for the day. I nodded in the right places, smiled when I was supposed to, pretended everything was fine. But I could feel it. The distance between us. The chasm that had been growing for years, but now felt wider than ever. And the worst part? He didn't even notice. Or maybe he did. Maybe he was just pretending too. The thought made my chest tighten. Had we been lying to ourselves for so long that neither of us knew how to be honest anymore? I didn't want to look. I knew who it was. But I looked anyway. Ryan, come outside. My pulse spiked. My hands tightened around my coffee cup. No, I couldn't. Not again. But my feet moved before my mind could stop them. Step after step, I walked to the door, my heart pounding against my ribs. The moment I stepped outside, the sun was blinding, the air thick with something unspoken. And there he was, standing by his car, arms crossed, eyes locked onto mine with that same quiet intensity. I can't do this, I whispered, even as my body betrayed me by stepping closer. Ryan's lips curled into a small, knowing smirk. Then why are you here? I opened my mouth to respond, to lie, to fix this, but nothing came out. Because he was right. I had already made my choice. Some choices can't be undone. What would you have done in my place? Was this just a mistake waiting to happen, or was it inevitable? Tell me in the comments below. Subscribe now, because what happens next? It's the moment where everything spirals out of control. Have you ever felt invisible in your own relationship? Like you could disappear, and the person you swore forever to wouldn't even notice? Like you could scream, cry, beg to be seen, and all you'd get in return is silence. Because that's how it started for me. Not with some grand betrayal. Not with lies or deception. But with something worse, being forgotten. I never set out to cross a line. I never thought I'd find myself standing in a place where right and wrong blurred so completely that I couldn't tell the difference anymore. But when someone finally looks at you like you exist, when someone notices the things no one else does, when they make you feel alive again after years of feeling like a ghost, how do you walk away from that? Tell me, what would you have done in my place? Would you have stopped it before it started? Would you have fought harder for the love that was slipping through your fingers? Or would you have done exactly what I did, take one more step? Just one more, thinking it still wasn't too late to turn back. Because here's the truth no one tells you. Sometimes, you don't realize you're falling until you've already hit the ground. I need to hear from you. I need to know, have you ever been in a situation where you knew what you were doing was wrong, but you couldn't stop? Have you ever been torn between the life you built and the life you secretly longed for? And if you have, if you've stood on that same ledge, staring down into the consequences of your own choices, did you jump? Or did you turn back? Let me know in the comments. I'm listening. If you've made it this far, you already know. Life isn't black and white. It's messy. It's complicated. It's full of choices we wish we didn't have to make. And if you want more stories that don't shy away from the raw, unfiltered truth of human emotions, like this video, subscribe and turn on notifications. Because what happens next? Trust me, you don't want to miss it. There are moments in life that change you forever. Not always in big, dramatic ways, but in the quiet, irreversible shifts. The kind that happen so subtly, you don't even realize they're shaping you into someone you don't recognize anymore. Some lines, once crossed, can never be erased. I learned that the hard way. You think you're in control. You tell yourself you can stop anytime, that you're not the kind of person who makes these kinds of mistakes. But then, one day, you wake up and realize the damage is already done. You can't unsay the words. You can't unfeel the emotions. You can't erase the moments you let happen, the ones that left fingerprints on your soul. If you're feeling unseen in your relationship, maybe the answer isn't in someone else's gaze, but in asking yourself what you truly need. Because no amount of attention, no fleeting rush of excitement, no stolen moment will ever fill the emptiness inside you if you don't first figure out why it's there. I thought Ryan was the answer. I thought feeling desired again, feeling wanted, would somehow fix what was broken inside me. But all it did was show me the cracks I had been trying to ignore. Because the truth is, this was never about him. It was about me. About the pieces of myself I had lost. About the version of me I no longer recognized. About the love I was searching for in all the wrong places. And now? Now, I have to live with the weight of knowing that some choices don't just affect you. They ripple. They break things. They leave scars on people who never deserve them. I wish I could say that I made the right choice in the end. That I turned back before it was too late. That I did the honorable thing. But the truth? The truth is, I don't know if there ever was a right choice. Not after everything that had already happened. Because once you open that door, once you let temptation in, it doesn't just leave. It lingers. It stays in the quiet moments, in the spaces between words, in the places where guilt and longing meet. So now, I have to ask myself, can you ever really go back to who you were before? Or do you just learn to live with the person you've become? I don't have that answer yet. But what I do know is this: the past can't be undone. But the future? That's still in my hands, for now. To anyone out there who feels invisible, who feels unseen, who is standing at the same crossroads I once did, I just want you to ask yourself one thing: is it really worth it? Because trust me, once you cross that line, you don't get to choose who gets hurt in the fallout. And some things, once broken, they never quite go back to the way they were. Think before you cross a line you can't erase. If this story made you think, if you've ever found yourself questioning your own choices, let me know in the comments. And if you want more real, unfiltered stories that expose the raw, complicated truth about human relationships, like, subscribe, turn on notifications. Because trust me, this is just the beginning.